Well, a very warm welcome to everyone here this evening. I'm Wilson Sibbett. I'm a Vice President here at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And although we'll be concentrating on science and some of the aspects of information that is being disseminated within science this evening, it is worth remembering that the Royal Society of Edinburgh is our national academy. It deals with science, engineering, the arts and humanities. So it's a very broadly based organisation. So if you've not been here before, a very warm welcome to you this evening. Very warm welcome to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, but also a warm welcome to this evening's event. I think it's a delight to see so many of you who have turned out, because it is a very, very important subject, the subject being science as a public enterprise. Why and how should science be open? And the format for this evening really is that we will have a talk from Professor Geoffrey Boulton. I'll mention more about Geoffrey in a moment. And he will give you the background to the study that's being undertaken by the Royal Society in London. But this is very much a road test within the Royal Society of Edinburgh, because this is a subject that goes across all of the boundaries. So following that, there will be two short presentations, one by Sir Ken Calman and the other by Steve Yearley, who will just give us one or two insights into their reactions on some of the early conclusions and some of the inputs that have been made to that. And then there will be a question and answer session, which will be open for you all to participate in that. And if the times hold out okay, then that should be almost an hour that will be devoted to that question and answer. And then I'll make one or two comments at the end. Now, there will be a panel here, and I will introduce the various members of that later. But I should say that it is the intention that this entire proceedings will be recorded as an audio disc or an audio track, and that will appear on the RSE website at some point. So if there's something you haven't quite picked up or whatever, there will be an opportunity to browse over that at some length. So the idea is that we will have a talk outlining this subject of science as a public enterprise from Professor Boulton. And just to say, there's no one really better qualified to do this than Professor Boulton because of his wide-ranging background. His day job was the head of Department of Geology and Geophysics at the University of Edinburgh, and he served for a number of years as a vice principal in the university there. But Geoffrey is currently the chairman of the Royal Society study group on this topic, and his experience and expertise include being a member of the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology. He served here as the General Secretary from 2007-2011 at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He served in the Scottish Science Advisory Committee, and he's chair of the Research Committee of the League of European Research Universities, member of the Natural Environment Research Council, and a member of the Scottish Funding Council. So Geoffrey has seen things from very many perspectives, and it is a delight to know that he's taking these roles of chairing a group like this. And so, Geoffrey, we're delighted that you're able to give an outline presentation of science as a public enterprise. Professor Boulton.
Well, thank you very much, Wilson. This morning I saw what I'm going to say from a rather critical perspective, that of my youngest daughter, who, when I told her what I was going to say, she said, "Daddy, that's terribly nerdy." So I'm going to try to lighten what she regarded as a rather nerdy exercise. As Wilson has said, I chair this Royal Society work group, which we've given this rather grandiose title, Science as a Public Enterprise. And as he said, the purpose from our perspective of this meeting this evening is to road test some of the emerging ideas. In other words, is this vehicle that we've created, does it keep to the road? Does it steer well? Does it have all the wheels that it should have? Is it well protected from the elements? Or can you see major flaws in it that will undermine what at the moment we feel we want to say? So the discussion for us later on will be very important as a significant input into what we may write. We hope to produce a report sometime in the period between the end of February and the middle of May. But firstly, let me try to create some context. This man on the left is Michael Henry, or was Michael Henry Oldenburg. He was a founder member of the Royal Society in London, which was founded about 1660. He was its first secretary, and he edited the Philosophical Transactions of the Society, the first edition of which was produced in 1665, some 5 years after it had been created. It was the world's second scientific journal, and as the world's first scientific journal, which is French, was closed down by Napoleon. It's been far and away the world's longest science journal. Oldenburg also invented the process of peer review, where before he published papers in this journal, he sent them out to experts to ask the question, is what's been written sensible? Is it consistent with the facts that you know them? Is this person taking someone's ideas and presenting them as his or her own? And so on. Historians of the development of science in the 17th and 18th centuries, a man called Steve Shapin in particular, who was at Edinburgh, is now at Harvard, have argued that this was one of the key events which essentially led to the great flowering of science in the 17th and 18th centuries, the so-called scientific revolution. Why was it so important? Well, gentlemen had been doing science for a long time. Some of them, Galileo for example, were very tight with the evidence which underpinned their ideas. The tradition of science prior to this had been very much, it's a discourse between gentlemen, and I'm afraid they almost all were gentlemen, or let's say men at least, whether they were gentle or not is another matter. And there was very little open access to the things that they said and did. And this journal created open access for the first time. It was the first step in what some of us like to think of as open science. And what it did was to present the evidence underlying the arguments that these people produced in their papers so that others could scrutinize it, interrogate it, and either repeat it or demonstrate that it was unrepeatable and probably wrong. Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog in the 19th century, referred to one of the ironies of science, that very frequently one has a beautiful theory destroyed by an ugly fact. And this development was a means whereby beautiful theories could be destroyed by ugly facts. Now, in the last half century, we have seen an extraordinary, breathtaking increase in the pace of scientific discovery and the development of science-based technologies that have changed all our lives. We've put people into orbit around the moon. We've penetrated deeply into space. We've unraveled some of the molecular complexities which animate life. We have probed into the history of our planet by taking cores in the deep oceans and the ice sheets. We're able now, by modern communication mechanisms, to see or hear and watch Scotland being beaten on football pitches, but with grace and decorum in Japan and Germany and Russia as they happen. And of course what's also happened is that remarkable means whereby information can be stored, manipulated, transmitted has been put in the hands not only of governments but also of ordinary citizens. Something really rather fundamental has happened. Science is and will continue to influence the lives of all of us, and arguably at a rate which is likely to grow in future rather than diminish. So it's in part those reasons which led us to embark on this inquiry, to ask the question, is science adequately engaging with those whose lives are and will continue to be influenced by scientific discovery? In a democratic society, to have processes foisted on us without our agreement is a rather irksome thing. And arguably, if democracy in relation to this powerful enterprise of science is to be fully accommodated, then we need to be part of the process as citizens, in addition to those of us who may be part of the process as scientists. Now, one of the groups that gave evidence to our inquiry wrote the following, that the new tools made available by the digital revolution present the opportunity for cultural change within the research community every bit as great as that triggered by the invention of scientific journals, and it could lead to a second open science revolution. Well, if you were a dispassionate observer, the hopefully mythical man from Mars, you'd be dumbfounded at how in an age of multimedia, of smartphones, of 3D television, of 24/7 information, of sophisticated social networking mechanisms, scholars and researchers continue to develop and transmit their thoughts to each other in ink on paper or its electronic equivalent. Somehow, the process by which science is done on a day-to-day basis has not really adapted to the changes in communication and information technology around us. But things may be changing. In January 2009, this man, Tim Gowers of Cambridge, who was a Fields Medalist, which is the mathematical equivalent of a Nobel Prize, posed a question on his blog in which he wrote, "Is massively collaborative mathematics possible?" And what he did was to pose an unsolved problem that had lain unsolved for the best part of 100 years. He put on his blog his ideas about theoretical and practical ways of solving the problem, and he invited others to contribute to a discussion about it. Well, within about 37 days, 27 people made more than 800 substantive contributions and comments, with tentative ideas being rapidly developed or discarded. Together they solved not only the core problem, but also a rather more difficult generalization of the problem, which in mathematical terms is not an easy thing to do. And Gowers commented, this was too driving as ordinary research is to pushing a car. In other words, there are much more dynamic ways of doing science than is the norm, by enhancing the communication that modern technology is putting into our hands and having ideas passing backwards and forwards in a much more dynamic and electric fashion. Networking of this sort, of course, can also be a powerful and effective guardian against poor science. In late 2010, a NASA press release was followed by an article in the top-flight American journal Science, which claimed that a bacterium from a lake in California incorporated arsenic in the place of phosphorus in its DNA backbone. What then ensued was what could be, I think, properly classified as an internet riot. There was no tear gas, as far as I'm aware, but it really was quite violent. It was led by an American microbiologist called Rosie Redfield, and it quickly discredited the claim with abundance of evidence, with Redfield dismissing the claim in the paper as lots of flim-flam but very little reliable information. And the idea now lies in the grave. So there are powerful means of working there which are relatively novel. Moreover, we now have what some of us have begun to call a growing community of citizen scientists, and I say that without any hint of condescension, who engage with professional paid scientists to address important and significant problems. And these are not, in a sense, the old idea of an amateur working away in some interesting little corner. They contribute in a very fundamental way to many areas of science. The astronomers in particular have organized themselves such that the astronomy science community is now no longer simply the paid scientists, but it's those who have become expert and who effectively collaborate with them in undertaking major projects. So if you want to discover a new planet these days, the last thing you do is go to the School of Physics and Astronomy at Edinburgh University and ask them to look for a planet for you. What you do is you go to the amateurs who've got it taped, and they really are contributing substantially. In the middle graph shows it's a diagram which shows the location. It's an extraordinary diagram with black dots, many which now produce extensive ink covers. Black dots showing the location of all the astronomers amateur astronomers who contribute and was part of the astronomy science network. And of course, in the ornithological world and in botany, then they are developing rather powerfully. So what, in the context of these changes, is our inquiry about? Well, to a degree, it arose because of the furore surrounding the so-called ClimateGate affair at the University of East Anglia, where emails revealed what seemed to many of us to be rather extreme ways of expression, and indeed may well have revealed, and I do believe it did reveal, a really rather reprehensible unwillingness to release important information into the public domain. One of the reasons why that matters is, of course, issues like climate have profound potential implications for the human economy, for human life, and that somehow we, the public, should be prevented from looking at that data so that we ourselves can not simply sit there as stooges listening to some scientist on their hind legs telling us this is this and that is that. As intelligent members of society, we want to interrogate, or we should want to interrogate, what they have said. Is what they have said reasonable? Is it based on good evidence? What are the uncertainties? What is the potential for action? The imperative now in many areas that I would characterize as public interest science, and those are areas where the implications of the science for society are rather obvious, it seems to me it is a crucial issue. But there's also an issue of accountability. Traditionally, we scientists have been accountable to each other and almost no one else. But as the old patterns of deference die, really that sort of accountability isn't appropriate anymore. We need not only to reveal what we do and why we do it and what our results are in some detail to our fellow citizens, but also they need to be part of the process of the governance of science, saying, well, what are our priorities? I mean, you spend or the government spends your tax on a massive scale in supporting science in the UK. Do you approve of what is done and why it is done? Well, I suspect the answer is no, you haven't had that opportunity. But the view of many of us is that in a conditioned way, you should do so. So if science has had such a great impact as I claim, and as it's been so efficient and so effective, what's the problem? And the problem is essentially one of the public involvement in the process. That's why we set up our inquiry. Our working group consists of a couple of us who are natural scientists. We have a publisher from Nature. We have an ex-government chief scientist, a social scientist, a computer scientist, a lawyer, Graeme, Laurie, who's sitting down here in the front seat, a philosopher, and several people in the biomedical field, because, of course, one of the major areas of public concern about evidence for this or that lies in the biomedical field, and those are the staff that support the project. We've had quite a number of meetings so far. We've had 55 extremely helpful formal responses to our call for evidence, including a very good one from this society, and we've begun to interact on the international scale. But it soon became rather clear that the agenda, as I've outlined it, was far too big for a limited-term working party. And we soon realized that the heart of the issue was really about providing data in the public domain in ways that the public could interrogate it, use it, and consider it. If we're doing science in the public interest, as I believe we should be, what is that interest? Who decides what it is, and how do we ensure that it's adequately satisfied? Well, I would argue that there's a very simple underlying logic to scientific discovery. It's a very, very simple process at heart. First of all, we have an idea, a hypothesis. We believe that this may be true or that may be true. But that's not enough. What do? We either do an experiment or we go out to make some measurements or collect some data which would suggest whether that hypothesis might be true or not. We then publish the idea and the underlying data under the third bullet point. And that's a crucial moment. When you make that public, then you permit other people to look at what you've done, to interrogate your results, to ask the question, does the underlying data support the hypothesis you may be generating? You validate the data, that's to say, ask whether the data is internally consistent. You ask the question, can we replicate the experiment or the measurement? The sort of thing that's going on now in CERN, this rather marvelous implication that somehow we can travel faster than light, which would solve certainly some of my logistical problems. We can test the ideas, and if we're cleverer than the person who did the original work, we can use their data to much better effect. And actually the number of young scientists who've said to me, if only I could get the data that senior scientist holds close to their chest, I could do a much better job with it than they could. And of course, that phase of validation, replication, testing then leads us either to refute the argument or refute the hypothesis, it's wrong, or we reinforce it by saying, yes, actually, it's right, and we can add a little bit more to it, or we can say, well, actually, the hypothesis, there's a much better hypothesis. And that's a fundamental cycle of scientific discovery, I would argue, and the crucial step is what I call the self-correcting step in the middle. Publish the information and let people look at it to establish whether they can replicate it and validate it. And arguably, the speed of that cycle, the time it takes to go from step 1 to step 5, is an index of the efficiency of the process. If that takes 30 years or 100 years, and in some cases it does, that's rather slow. Tim Gower's little experiment took a few days, and I'm not suggesting that's what we should be necessarily targeting, but it shows just what can be done. So if we were changing the way we do science, what is the changing context? What's the rationale for doing it? And I've put 4 here. First of all, there are new technological possibilities that I've tried to describe. Secondly, we now have massive data volumes, and they themselves create opportunities and problems. About 30 years ago, I'm a geologist, I did a field experiment, and by a dint of extremely hard work, we collected 6 data points. We published a paper giving all our methods, the uncertainties associated with them, all the data in full detail, and others then tried to replicate the experiment. They found they could do so, but then actually they found that they could explain the phenomenon rather better than we could. And things have moved on a great deal since then. Last winter, no, the winter before last, I was in Antarctica on what's essentially a follow-up to this line of thinking, the experiment we did 30 years ago, but this time we used modern methods of data acquisition and modern methods of data storage, and we collected about 6 terabytes of data, which is a lot more data. Can I find a journal in which I can publish that data? No. No journal would dream of looking at it. How can I make it available so that others can interrogate it? Well, of course, we can do it via the web so that you could look at the data. Would that help you? No, it wouldn't. All you'd find would be lists of numbers with rather arcane headings at the top. In order to make it so that you could use it, then what I would have to do is to translate that data into a bit more scientific meaning. I have to say what this column meant and what that column meant. I then have to recount some of the scientific background to the experiment, what the implications might be, and then give you tools to interrogate it and develop it. So although massive data, the capacity to collect massive amounts of data has been a great bonus to science, at the same time it's created a real problem. The possibility that what we did in the past of making data available, so this crucial step of testing and validation could take place, is much more difficult now, simply because the data volumes are so great, and unfortunately and sadly, because too many of we scientists hoard our data to our chest. As one of my colleagues has recently written, the real science often lies in the data. The published paper is often just an advertisement for it. And somehow we've got to make it available, that deep information available. The next major problem, I think, or opportunity and problem, is that of computer simulation. Now, many of us use modern computers to try to solve complex problems that in the past were really quite beyond our means. The difficulty is that because they are so complex and because the interactions that take place in the computer are very complex too, if you ask me the question, well, here's a computer simulation I've done, these are the results, why do the results look like that? I would have to say, well, actually, I don't know. That's what the model tells me. And in a sense, what's happened is the manipulations are so complex that the distance between cause and effect becomes very large, and it's very difficult for the scientists to give a simple explanation of why the results are as they are. Now, of course, these simulation models help us to do things like build buildings and bridges more cheaply than they've ever been built, but to the same standards of durability. But at the same time, there are many areas where they have important implications for society. Just think of some of the models that bright young economists and financial dealers have been dealing with in recent years. They have enormous implications, and somehow we need to understand it, and there are many in the domain of computer simulation believe that there's a crisis in computer simulation, an important part of science, which somehow has to be resolved by digging into these models and asking the question, what do they really do? And the fourth part of the changing context is really what I stated before, and that is we quite properly, intelligent citizens, should want to know more about the evidence for some of the claims that are made by scientists on our behalf. So we're arguing that there is here what we've called an enabling principle about what we call open science, and by that we mean that the underlying evidence for a scientific theory should be made available and accessible to all who wish to use it, whether they're scientists or whether they're citizens. And secondly, that the publication, the formal scientific publication, should also be made accessible. At the moment, because I belong to a university, I can interrogate a large number of publications. The university buys the rights to access those publications electronically for a very, very large amount of money. And if you are a citizen scientist, then actually getting access to those publications is extremely difficult. So we think there's an enabling principle there. But is openness of this sort a universal principle? We would argue no. There are legitimate commercial interests, if you like, that are legitimate. We want to see the excellence of British science translated into a bit more excellence in British science-intensive business. And that means some of the data which they use is intellectual property, which they will keep close to their chests. There are also fundamental issues of privacy and confidentiality. In vital information that relates to public health, for example, we as citizens often, in rather too easy a fashion, give our personal information away to large databases which are then used for decision making. And privacy and confidentiality are key issues. And of course security. The security of your bank balances, national security in terms of terrorism and crime. So there are some absolutely fundamental issues. What are the benefits of having open science? Well, we think it speeds up the discovery cycle. And that arguably is in the public interest. What is the public interest? My view is that a society that is knowledgeable has a great advantage. In the modern world, it means how can we live in a more sustainable fashion on a finite planet? How can we devise means whereby the support for our daily lives is optimized? How can we minimize conflict? How can we minimize inefficiency? Secondly, open science involves more brains. You're putting what you've done out into the open domain, and a larger number of people can access that and think about it. You know, all those young people who are dying to get their hands on some valuable information, what we should be doing is giving it to them. And of course it's crucial, as I keep repeating, that the involvement of citizens in the scientific project in some way or another, either active involvers or passive involvement, is really important in a democratic society. And also we're beginning to realize that in many sectors of business, then open science is seen as a potential benefit to the effectiveness of business. That business doesn't necessarily thrive on secrecy, it very often thrives on openness, and it can be a stimulant for economic development. You'll excuse me if I think Emperor Joseph is said to have said to Mozart that he used too many notes, and I think I'm suffering from exactly the same problem. Just a couple of examples of the benefits of open science, of the way I've described it. The genomic sequence of the HIV virus was published years and years after the discovery of the virus itself. In contrast, the genomic sequence for the SARS virus was established only a few weeks after the first report in 2003 of an outbreak in Hong Kong. And it was a consequence of novel international collaboration utilizing the data freely and openly. In March and early April 2009, groups around the world rushed to put their sequence data online as a consequence of the N1H1 swine flu outbreak, such that some 5 weeks after the outbreak people became aware of the outbreak, it was possible to submit to the science journal Nature a detailed analysis of the data and showing how the various avian, human and porcine origins of the genetic components of the virus had arisen. But it shouldn't be, the idea of open science shouldn't just be restricted to publicly funded science. There are areas of privately funded commercial work that should also be open. For example, in clinical trials, we, members of the public, very often give freely our information and our time to companies that are establishing major clinical trials. What those companies then do is very frequently merely release the positive evidence that shows that there is a cause and effect between the drug that they've developed and its positive consequences on a human population. What they almost never do is put out negative information. So if there's no effect, they don't publish it. And the consequence of that is our understanding of the relationship between cause and effect is strongly skewed. There was an excellent example a few years ago of a major clinical trial on the aspirin drug, on aspirin, in which many major companies became involved. And it demonstrated the enormous power of sensible clinical trials, where something like 95,000 individuals contributed data on taking aspirin, and it led to a series of recommendations for doctors and GPs globally, which arguably have saved a great number of lives in recent years. And it's a remarkable support for the idea that the limits of open science are not the limits between private funding and public funding. It's a very hazy and complicated boundary, and somehow we have to get it right. So how do we create an open science culture? Well, first of all, you've got to work on us, the scientists. I'm afraid our motivation at the moment, if you're a typical academic scientist, the motivation for you is to publish a paper in ink on paper in a so-called high-impact journal in a very conventional way, using the same techniques that we used 350 years ago. The reason we do that is because our universities are funded for research according to an evaluation of the citations, or the number of times people have cited their published papers. And of course that's important for our careers. If I was still employed by the University of Edinburgh, I won't say whether I'm glad that I am or not, they certainly don't send me a payment check, but if I was still employed by them, what they would want from me is at least every 4 or 5 years, 4 or 5 papers in journals like Nature and Science. If I get involved in making my data available, that has no impact whatsoever on the university's financial bottom line. So somehow that has to change, and one of the ways one can do that, for example, is by making data citable. Because as I said, very often I think that the science is in the data, not in the published paper, which is just the advertisement. So somehow we need to make sure that data, that the work a scientist does in providing the data, putting it into an environment where it can be curated, making it available, is actually at least as highly regarded as the work they do in publishing papers. And of course, if one could do something like that, change the basis on which one is funded for doing science, then not only is the scientist's influence, but also their employer's influence, and that's the key step. And of course, our prestige as individuals is often registered by the way in which we publish in these so-called high-profile journals. What is the role of learned societies like this one and many others up and down the country that look after the different areas of science? Well, they're quite unique in a sense that what the learned societies have is a care for the way their discipline is prosecuted, the values that it has and the objectives that it has and the priorities that it has. Learned societies could play a big role in taking up the issue of open science and promoting it strongly. Carrying a big stick. Does it matter? Well, there's an interesting case of the Human Genome Project. A convention was signed a decade and a half ago now, which required all those that had funding to undertake studies of the human genome to release their results immediately to a publicly accessible database. If they didn't do that, they didn't get funded. And of course they did it because funding is a big stick. In other areas of genomics, the same doesn't apply. The same funding requirement doesn't apply. And what do? They keep their data to their chests. And one of the consequences is that in areas where open human genomic data is available, the rate of progress of the science is dramatically greater than other areas of genomic research where it ought to be, where it ought to be just as great as in the human genome domain. The publishers of research, the journals, of course, they're crucial. What they should do is make access to the data at the click of a mouse on a live link on the published paper a condition of publication. But we need to organise our digital infrastructure. We need to ask the question, well, where are we going to put all this data? What we shouldn't be doing is expecting people like me to put it on our individual websites. We might do that, but I won't live forever, and my data might be more important than I am. So somehow we've got to make it durable and reliable. And we need to think of national, international, institutional databases. We need, for example, for the University of Edinburgh to take it as part of its public policy and strategy to create, to be a custodian of its own data, not only a custodian, but also a means whereby that can be accessed. Of course, all this costs money. It costs time, and it costs real money. But the argument is, and the National Academy of Sciences in the US is working on this at the moment, the argument is that actually you get more research or more scientific output by putting a significant proportion of your effort into the collation and accessibility of data. And I think the arguments for that are growing. What's more, a number of industrialists now believe that there are things that can be done that will make an open science culture in Britain much more welcoming and creative in terms of benefits to the UK. There's, of course, an international dimension. I mean, these sorts of things can't be done overnight. It takes time. But science is an international project. What would happen if Britain went alone? Well, actually, we don't know. We might actually find ourselves in a very much better position than our rather more sluggish competitors. On the other hand, we might be massively disadvantaged, that others can take our data, but we can't see theirs. One of the things that we're trying to do is talk to other national academies. We've talked to academies in the States, in China. We're having a European meeting shortly to say, well, can we pull together in a direction which will make this sort of vision a reality? I've tried to persuade you of the importance of the issue. Hopefully I haven't been quite as nerdish as my youngest daughter expected me to be. And what I have tried to do is leave some obvious gaps so there'll be time and opportunity for debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Boulton, for that. Now we're going to have two short contributions just to follow up on that. The first by someone who will be well known to, I think, to many of you here, Sir Ken Calman. He was the Chief Medical Officer in Scotland, 89 to 91. It took a bit longer to sort England out. He was the Chief Medical Officer in England from 1991 to 1998. Chairman of the Executive Board of the World Health Organization, 98 to 99. Has been President of the British Medical Association and Chairman of the National Cancer Research Institute. Many of you will know that he chaired the Commission on Scottish Devolution that was established by the Scottish Parliament, and of course he is the Chancellor of Glasgow University and has been there since 2006. And the other contribution will be made by Professor Steve Yearley, and Steve joined the staff at Edinburgh University in 2005 as a Professor of the Sociology of Scientific Knowledge. Deals with a wide variety of projects relating to genomics and contemporary life sciences across a whole variety of key issues and concerns. So I'll ask these gentlemen to do short presentations, a follow-up, and then we'll have the panel. Sir Ken.
Thanks very much, Wilson. First of all, the Royal Society of Edinburgh welcomed the Royal Society initiative and indeed was very keen to respond. The multidisciplinary nature of RSE, as Wilson has already mentioned, we thought was a great benefit in doing that, and having arts and social science involvement actually gave a different edge to what we discussed. And what I want to do now is give a very brief summary of the paper we presented. We certainly agreed that science is a public enterprise, and that citizens should understand how science works and be encouraged to engage in what science can do. How the public get information and get knowledge is critical, and the media are essentially the primary source of that information. And Geoffrey's already made the point that it's actually quite difficult to access to scientific journals if you're outside the academic community. Sensationalist reporting is unhelpful, and more scientists should be involved in the media. Although we sometimes look at them slightly negatively because they shouldn't be doing that. They should be in a laboratory somewhere. And yet, look how important they've been. The new media, again, as you've mentioned, are important ways of communicating scientific ideas and results. Blogs are increasingly common, and the suggestion that there should be blog squads to deal with inaccurate reporting has been suggested. The Media Centre was considered to be a good example of that. And if I take one little example, that of MMR, the data, how it was reported, takes 5 years to recover from that. And if that data had been available, things might have been slightly different. As Geoffrey said, scientists should be encouraged to share data. Networking, again, a lovely example from Gowers, can create opportunities. Help from the Digital Curation Centre might actually be valuable. Storing the data, a point already made, could be done in a different way, of course, and could be done in library terms with an ISBN number. That would be your publication, a large database which can then be interrogated. Data, of course, should be shared more widely with the public. Access may be difficult, and again, as he's mentioned, the raw data might be available, but what does it mean without interpretation? And the distinction between data and information should be clear. The examples, and these are ones that I've had some involvement in, the National Cancer Research Institute has got two big databases, one of all the clinical trials in cancer in the UK, and secondly of all cancer research in the UK. What you can then do is interrogate that and find that we do a lot of very excellent basic science work, but almost no preventative and early diagnostic work, and you could redress the balance. We do a great deal in breast cancer, but not a lot in pancreatic cancer. And that allows you to reassess priorities, for example. The other thing which the British Library have been doing is having something called a patient participate in perspective. And they've run a series of workshops on information exchange and a whole range of conditions. One of the conclusions was that there should always be a lay summary at the end of each publication. Much of this is going to require what we call a cultural shift. That means we'll have to change. We'll also require resources, training and time to convert this raw data into accessible information and then to put it into context, and that's not going to be easy and will cost. Research councils and other funders, again, as you've raised, will need to recognise that, although you could do it in a sort of release-on-demand model if necessary. The issue of privately funded research, again, was raised, and in general, it was thought that they should, sorry, I think I've touched a button there, should be treated similarly. The ethical issues, and this was the importance of our social science dimension, should also be considered. Personalised information in rare diseases is obvious. It would be possible to identify individuals with a rare disease given the right thinking around it. And of course the whole quality of data. The international dimension was one that we also considered. We thought it should be international, otherwise the UK could in fact be disadvantaged by spending a lot of money on doing the data analysis. On the other hand, it could be a huge advantage to the UK to have a public and accessible database. And I keep touching this thing here, my apologies. Science policy matters also need to be considered, and the concept of the intelligent purchaser is very relevant, and shades of CP snow. We need those in policy positions to be aware of what science is, what are its methodologies and its limitations. Hence the importance of science education for those not doing science to develop an understanding of the issues involved. And this learning can take place at many levels. Finally, again, we welcome the initiative and look forward to further discussions.
Thank you, Gang. Thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you, Wilson. We've had a discussion, actually just through that door in the this kind of boardroom through there earlier today that have touched on many of these things. And I'm now a little uncertain about which thoughts that I'm going to reflect on mine and which are other people's. So if people feel that I'm stealing their thoughts, then, well, we live in an age of open science, and too bad. No, sorry, I don't mean that, obviously. I think at the heart of this discussion is it's a very important insight, but one that I think needs to be developed with care. I mean, clearly there's an important sense, as Geoffrey said, back to the 17th century, in the way in which science is necessarily or inherently about openness. That, as it were, the genius of modern science is about that it's not individuals having smart ideas, but that it's individuals communicating those ideas with a republic of science and then having them improved and checked and guaranteed by the opinions of suitably qualified and objective others. And in a sense, this openness of science is really about using the open expression of these ideas as a way of guaranteeing the objectivity of what you're claiming. So the openness is, in that sense, indivisible, inextricable from science, because the guarantee of its objectivity, that it's not just my opinion, but that it is robust in some way, is down to its openness. But on the other hand, that idea is kind of in a sort of tension with a kind of other notion about openness, which is that, on a certain view of openness, anybody's opinion is as good as anybody else's. And of course, science doesn't work like that. So that there's a tension here, and the thing to judge is, well, you want science to be more open because that will deliver more objectivity, more investigation, more checking, more appropriate accessibility. But on the other hand, openness doesn't mean that it just becomes a matter of anybody's opinion. And so I think that although this inquiry touches on a very important topic, there is something that has to be borne in mind about the connection between, as it were, making science ape a kind of democracy which it isn't, and on the other hand, making science more open. Now, I think Geoffrey identified a number of important things which are characteristic of the present, which are changing the demands on science and making the particular cause for openness now especially important. So one of those is clearly to do with the way in which information and communication technologies, the enormous growth in computing power and so on, changes the very idea of what data is. So as Geoffrey said, we probably used to stagger across the quad with a few, data cards, and that was about it. And now you can have vast amounts of data that nobody else could possibly scrutinize, and you probably don't even know every aspect of the data that you've had. And of course, under those circumstances, the idea that you could clutch it to yourself and stop other people interrogating that and examining that is probably a brake on scientific progress, and is probably just a kind of waste of public investment in all this data. So I think that there are very important kind of pragmatic considerations that make more openness a very good idea. But Geoffrey also mentioned the climate gate, the hacking into, or perhaps the leaking of those emails from University of East Anglia. And of course, this also speaks to another context in which openness is important, which is that in a number of key policy areas, climate change, I guess, most prominently amongst them, but a number of other things to do with regulation of drugs, the safety of chemicals, with regard to GMOs and all of these kinds of things. There's a sense in which the scientific community is involved in helping us trying to resolve policy issues on which there are a variety of strongly held opinions in society and where people have vested interest in the outcomes of these things. And of course, there's a danger here that the work of scientists, which is often channeled through conventional publications, actually gets kind of outflanked by the availability of information in blogs and on people using the new social media. There's a sense in which scientists who are trying to go through the reputable channels to say these things may find that their voices are drowned out because other people are putting things out in rather slick blogs that tweets make much more news than another scientific publication and so on. And I think the ClimateGate thing was especially important in this sense, that what it brought out was a kind of an inequality between scientists who are working within the confines of rigorous demands for publication, and on the other hand, the blogosphere, where you can say more or less anything, and where people who want to find support for their beliefs can find succor of various sorts. And of course, the odd thing about the blogosphere is it's no longer just made up of people expressing opinions, but you can find all manner of graphs. So if you want to investigate, the controversy about the hockey stick shaped curve, or you want to look at alleged trends in the way the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Organization in the States is supposedly changing data and so on, you can find rather plausible looking graphs and diagrams and scientific looking analyses on the web. So I think there are two kind of impulses at least behind this openness agenda. One is to do with the fact that we have much more data and you don't really want to hang on to that in a way that is economically and from a research policy point of view kind of inefficient. But on the other hand, a concern about the plethora of publication opportunities that the web and other affordances provide, and the way in which scientific opinion may be outflanked by these kind of things. Now, in the context of that, it seems to me that this report about science as a public enterprise, in some sense, ends up saying rather more about the way in which we should manage data than about the way in which we should restate the priorities for scientific practice, or the way in which the scientific community can respond to the challenges that are provided by the world of blogs and tweets and online commentaries and so on. So Geoffrey was talking about the extent to which the research excellence framework and the research assessment exercise that preceded it, these give a strong incentive to scientists to produce scientific papers, and they provide a disincentive to do various other things. Well, there's a real trade-off for people working in the climate area about, they feel an urgent need to rebut these apparently fallacious claims that populate the blogosphere, but of course they don't receive much recognition for doing it, and it ends up having to be coming from, as it were, their private time or their non-research time, driven by their commitment to these things, rather than being recognized within their official responsibilities. You get these then worries about, whether scientists are being more like activists or scientists in these areas. So it seems to me that there is a broader concern about science's place in the policy context, what the openness of science in the age of the internet really means. And I think if we see this debate as one that's basically about how do we manage our data, we aren't maybe taking a full recognition of what's at stake in these present issues. And the final thing that I want to just draw attention to is I thought that Geoffrey's slide about the citizen scientists I mean, that's a tremendously interesting idea and a tremendously uplifting prospect, that people are doing these things about monitoring biodiversity or looking for new migration routes of birds or are doing things about looking for new planetary phenomena and so on. But there's also a sense in which those examples, the citizens who are doing science are not rocking the scientific agenda at all. They're fitting in to what scientists might have been doing, but just, they're adding more hands. More hands make light work of this kind of thing. Whereas it seems to me that quite a lot of the politics that surround science at the moment are to do with scientists who are trying to disrupt or to offer alternative stories about climate change not happening or, various environmental issues or even maybe, smoking and other public health issues not being so important. And so this question of whether citizen science is always a kind of an adjunct and a support to science, or whether in some sense some citizen science is about offering a more profound challenge to how those citizens construe mainstream science as operating, is I think also something that should come up within the concerns of this report. So, I mean, I welcome this work very much, but it seems to me, and I think in our discussion earlier today, there's, I mean, this is almost an invitation to Geoffrey to carry on, do SAPE 2 and 3. I think there are broader issues here, and that if we focus just on this as a question about the best ways to manage our data, to produce more science and to produce more cost-effective science, then we're maybe not getting at the most politically conflictful and policy important bits of these issues. Thank you very much indeed.
Now we're reaching the phase in the programme where you will have your opportunity to ask questions, so could I just ask four gentlemen to take their seats here at the front. They will be joined by Graeme Laurie, who was mentioned in one of Geoffrey's slides as a lawyer. Graeme is a professor of medical jurisprudence at Edinburgh University, and his research specialisation is in the role of law in promoting and regulating science, medicine and technology. So we have these learned gentlemen here. No doubt you will have had questions in your own mind when you came tonight, and there may well be others. I should explain that we do have roving microphones, so those of you who do have questions, please take a microphone, and if you wish, please give your name and the background from which you're speaking, and that's very helpful to us. But any questions, just go right ahead. Yes, just beside you. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Duncan McMillan, and I'm involved with the protests in St Andrews Square in Occupy Edinburgh. I guess my question is really it's about a reality check. I love this idea about open science and open source science. My view of the world is that, since settlement, humans have been able to produce surplus to their own requirements, and then who has the right over that surplus if other people has become a kind of growing competition over the years, and we become growingly, increasingly sophisticated about how we get control of the world's resources in a competitive context. Now, in that context, so in the context of private greed and desperate needs for control, and we have military organizations that are dedicated to maintaining control at all costs, and corporate organizations doing similar things. How can scientists who really are motivated by public spirit and want to do good things for the planet and for humanity, how can they get more power when so much of what they do relies on funding, which is in minority hands, and is often, it's very. I think it must be very difficult to resist the pressures to maintain, to continue supporting the current power structure. So how can scientists get more leverage and get more power over their work?
Okay, thank you. Who would like to?
Well,
That's an easy question.
Well, no, I'm, as it were, the easy choice for this, so I don't mind talking to this, but I appreciate somebody else coming in as well. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that of course, right from the start, the scientific enterprise, there are all these famous Marxist analyses of the history of science which show, that right from the very beginning there was a close connection between military needs and early studies in ballistics and so on. And, of course, science has never been able to entirely escape from the influence and the interest of the power that supports it. On the other hand, the scientific community has, I think, been strenuous and by and large sincere in wanting to be motivated independently by what scientists find out about the natural world. And there's this kind of slogan, but I think it makes some sense, that science is about speaking truth to power. I mean, that science finds out how the world, the aim is to find out how the world actually is, and then to tell the political masters or whoever it is, well, you may want this, but you can't have it because, tough luck, that's how the world is. Now, I think that one could imagine taking I'm not saying that I'm in favour of this, but one could imagine taking the open science agenda, as it were, further up the chain of political command over science, and saying, well, part of what you could be open about is the setting of the research agenda. In Britain, most of our research funding comes now through the research councils, so people at universities apply to the research councils to support research. But the agenda for what those research councils are doing is negotiated between scientists and politicians and business leaders and so on, so that the fact that there's a lot of money in synthetic biology is partly to do with the commercial applications that are anticipated from that area. Now, one could imagine doing something more radical about who gets to have a say about that research agenda. But, of course, then that would leave untouched the approximately equal amount of money that's funded by commercial laboratories, which we think of as not, being open to public control at all, and in which the public, the open science agenda doesn't really speak to, because, that is seen as something that's proprietary and that firms can do what they like with their profits. But,
Should I have a little crack?
Yeah.
It's a rather fierce question to open with. But, arguably, actually probably unarguably, since the beginnings of organised human society, then knowledge has been the means whereby society has changed the way it does things. Many would say improved, some might not agree. And if you ask what has that knowledge been responsive to, then the answer largely is by those who make decisions about priorities in society. And that to a large degree is not you or I, although one aspires to something rather better. The difficult part of all this, of course, is exactly what Steve's mentioned, and that is who sets the agenda. I might well argue, and I think I probably would be quite argumentative about it, that science, in the inferences it makes, is a pretty independent and neutral enterprise. What is not neutral is what it studies, because that's largely determined by the flow of money. Someone showed a slide earlier today showing the source of funding. I think it was probably in the US for science, and something like 60% of that came from the military-industrial complex. I mentioned the issue of the governance of science, in the sense who sets the priorities. And my view is that ought to be a more democratic process than it currently is. You have to be a little bit careful, of course, because, what I try to do as an individual scientist, I subvert the priorities of the research councils that give me money. They have a clear idea of what they want. They want to do this or that or the other. I have a longer-term idea of what I want to understand. What I do is I utilise their research grants to satisfy them, of course, which I must do, otherwise they won't give me another one, but my real objective is to do something slightly different. So the priorities of those who fund and those who are funded are very often not the same. Now, Steve mentioned this sort of lovely phrase of speaking truth to power, and the question is how many scientists are prepared to do so, how many scholars in any field are prepared to do so? And my view is that not many. And the structures of which most of us are part, the organizational structures, have some pretty fierce ways of dealing with those benighted souls who step out of line. So you've identified an enormously important issue. It's one of the reasons I'd rather like to live to 500, is just see what happens from here on.
Graeme, you want to add something?
Yes, just briefly, just going to say something on the role of intellectual property in all of this, because I think sometimes in these debates there can be a tendency to sort of caricature what intellectual property does and how it can be used or certainly abused, and sometimes casting it as some sort of unqualified evil as opposed to openness being some sort of unqualified good. And of course the reality is neither of those two things. And I think in the context of intellectual property, what's often forgot, both in theory and in practice, is that a core aspect of intellectual property, in order to get the rights, is actually to disclose information into the public domain. And in return for that disclosure, you then get certain types of monopoly rights. Now, of course, often these can be exploited in ways that we would not think were appropriate. And we might want, therefore, to address the ways in which, for example, we can be more imaginative about licensing and other practices in and around intellectual property and the way in which it's actually exercised, as opposed to necessarily calling into question the existence of intellectual property rights in the first place. So you can see an example there would be the Creative Commons movement, whereby you can actually take the fact that you have rights in copyright or science or patents or whatever, and you use the licensing in order to require others to continue to share and to pass on information, to allow other access, rather than necessarily saying that intellectual property in itself is somehow a problem and therefore should not be part of the picture.
Okay, just another question.
Michael Foreman, University of Edinburgh. My question was actually independent of the one from the back, but about IP. Professor Boulton made the observation that legitimate commercial interests require that IP is required so that the UK can benefit from UK science, and I find this a non sequitur. That certainly was what came across in the speech. If you deny it, that's great. If we had export restrictions on IP, you might do that, but if we have an open market in information that allows it to be sold to the highest bidder, you're likely to get exactly the opposite effect. So I think the open science movement, and I think in some sense it might become a movement, allows us to reconsider some of these difficult questions about what should we do with IP? How do we best let society benefit from the discoveries? And Creative Commons is one approach to that. But I think it changes the nature of the debate, because information can be shared more effectively and more quickly than ever before. So just comments on, how do we justify the need for IP in this new world?
Well, first of all, when I spoke of legitimate commercial interests, I meant commercial interests that are legitimate. If you ask the question why the UK government invests in science, the principal reasons are for economic benefit. The principal reason for economic benefit. A much more complicated and difficult question is how is economic benefit realised if we accept, as I suspect most people in this room do, that's a priority in relation to the funding for science. We've talked to quite a wide spectrum of business enterprises. What's interesting is that there are very strikingly different views about this. So, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, which is shifting the way in which it does business, their view is that a culture of open science and with openly accessible data would be very much to their benefit, and they would be sucked towards a scientific culture and scientific environment where that was true. If you then move to the engineering industries, then the answer is, well, they would look at things very, very differently, and they would have a much sharper view of intellectual property. I mean, I might add that 40 years ago in a university, if you'd mentioned the phrase intellectual property, no one would have understood what you meant. We didn't think that it was possible to hold intellectual property. It was just something that we did. So I think, the big leap is what is the most, if your interest is culling economic benefit, then what is the most effective way of doing that? And I think my answer would be there is no one single answer to that, but Graeme, I think, is an expert.
I would absolutely agree. There's absolutely no single answer to that, because intellectual property works very differently across different sectors, and very different sectors claim that they require it to varying degrees. What is interesting, I think, and what is slightly tragic, is that there's actually quite a dearth of evidence as to how well and how far intellectual property rights actually necessarily do work and do make an economic difference. There's more evidence in some sectors rather than others. So we could certainly be seeking more economic evidence as to what is the actual impact of intellectual property. But I think also, picking up on what Geoffrey was saying there, one thing that's changed culturally more recently is this notion that the private sector, perhaps ironically, when it's not what one would necessarily imagine, the private sector, many sectors of the private sector, are now more willing to collaborate based on the intellectual property that they have and to share, unlike the public sector, which is the main focus of this report from the Royal Society, tends still to have a "it's my ball and we're not necessarily playing" attitude. So there might be lessons that we can learn from the private sector that they themselves have learned about using intellectual property over the last few decades.
There's a question down on the left, and then the lady here is next, and then there's a question here, and then there.
Mark Woolhouse, University of Edinburgh. I'm a practicing scientist, and I am 100 and something % behind the idea of open access data and all of us publishing our data. If I'm going to do it, and we have tried to do this on several occasions, I would love to do it well. And there were several allusions to the challenge of actually annotating, explaining, providing the metadata, putting it up on the right website. This is actually not trivial at all. Mm-hmm. On some of the projects I'm involved in, I would guess it would add 10 or 20% to the research budget. It's not currently paid for. And I would love to know how you're going to solve that problem, coupled with a rather cynical fact that actually most of it won't be picked up. There will be gems in there, some of which the scientific community will find. I think all my research is wonderful and people should pick it up. But actually, for a lot of cases, they're not going to be interested. So this effort to do it well and do it properly will, in fact, be wasted in a lot of instances. I just can't find a way to make that cost-benefit calculation. But obviously, you will have thought about it much more deeply.
Yeah. Can I agree with the problem? But it is, but it is something I think we need to consider. Can I draw your attention to the British Library publication on Patients Participate, suggesting that there is a short note on each part of it. That's the point I was trying to make about the additional cost. It's not just simple, it's actually quite complicated, particularly to put the databases in some kind of order to make them accessible. The point, however, is that if we want society to benefit from science, the ability of the public generally to understand what's going on would be really helpful. And one of the points, and I didn't respond to the first question, which is quite clear, is that evidence-based policy making is actually quite an interesting concept. It may not be true, but if you have, as I have done in a sort of public health area, look at the science and listen to the science, and then present it to ministers and say, why don't we just stop cigarette smoking somewhere? That would be a good idea, wouldn't it? And watch what happens. We have to become much more articulate in telling the stories properly, and it's telling the stories. And many ministers that I know well work quite clearly by anecdote. You know, I was out at the weekend, and I met a surgeon who said we could run the NHS a different way. Why don't we do it? Yes, well, of course, Minister, we could do that. And the issue is very much like that. And I think we have to get better at telling the story about whatever the experiment is. And I think, having been in a Vice-Chancellor's chair, to sit down for 3 hours with particle physicists, of which I know nothing, to appoint a chair in particle physics is probably the best educational experience you can have. You get the 3 top minds in the world thinking and telling you, and they have to explain it to me before and if they can't, you wonder why you want them. So, I mean, I think deep down, it's a very public thing to do. And indeed, one of the things that I did when I was a real professor was actually have a series of public meetings trying to explain the problems of cancer care and how do we do it. I learned hugely from that about how I could have done it better. And I think that's part of it. And I think we should be encouraging scientists to speak to the media, to talk to the media, to encourage things going. Otherwise, the people out there won't know what's going on. And neither will the politicians. And they won't change that.
I'll just carry on that with a few more questions. Yes,
Catherine Smith, I suppose I should now call myself a citizen scientist because I've been a lone voice in the wilderness ever since I was hung out to dry for speaking truth to power. Now, my concern in all of these important discussions you're having is a lack of agreement and definition of words amongst the various parties talking. You do not agree amongst you on the meanings of the words data and information, but that's a minor point. My major point goes back to the first point that was raised about human competitiveness. I put it that way rather than human greed, because I would cast your minds back to the period 70 years ago and think about that period when we consider the whole question of exposing all our understanding, which is a word very different from data and information, by the way, of exposing all our scientific understanding in all fields to the whole world. 70 years ago, when Britain stood alone, Britain was very uncomfortable that its open science approach of the patent process had made available to Nazi Germany the understanding of radar and the understanding of the development of the jet engine. So can I ask, have you considered in your discussions, or is it too early in your discussions yet to consider the whole question of the long-term evolving context of the openness of scientific inquiry?
I think yes is the answer. It seems to me that that's one of the questions that we've raised. And Geoffrey mentioned it under the heading, I think, which was security. There are quite clear issues which you may not want to have in terms of open science. On the other hand, much of it is open. And I think that's an issue that needs debate. Would you close it down? Would you say no?
I wouldn't say no to open science, no.
But you would say no to...
There must be boundaries.
And I think that's part of the discussion.
Yeah. If I may just briefly, one of the problems at the moment is that many scientists working in particular fields don't realise how the work they are doing can be associated with the work that someone else is doing to produce a concoction that looks very different from what they thought they were doing. And that's one of the really difficult areas whereby we need to think very carefully about the consequences not just of our work, but the way in which, particularly using modern methods of collating data from different sources, it's possible to construct very penetrating perceptions which were a million miles away from the individual aspirations of those who contributed. So it's a difficult one.
Steve?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, two rather discrepant things that I'd like to say. I mean, the first is that I think you raise a very interesting point about, if you look back 70 years, well then you might ask yourself how wise this agenda is. I mean, even if one pushed it through, one might not want to be where it led. But it does seem to me that, you could counterpose to that the idea that, although it's often security concerns are very prominent these days, it seems to me that if I had to pick something to be worried about, I'd be worried about the environment. And it seems to me that the environment is a good case for there being collaboration and openness and sharing. So the more people who are able to work on biodiversity protection, or to understand what's going on in the oceans as they warm, or to work out what's happening to species as they change their migration patterns, or to work out what's likely to be the consequences of climate change for what happens in the Antarctic. I mean, those seem to me to be about our and maybe the world's security in some profound sense. And I think those would probably be helped by this agenda rather than that. So if one wanted to pick a kind of story to set this in a bigger context, I'm not sure that I'd want to look back, but I'd look forward to something that I'm positively worried about. The other thing that I'd say is that I think you're very right to pick us up on, moving slickly between information, data, and understanding, and so on. And I think there is something that's very interesting about the issue of deciding what it is. I mean, if there were this money to put all the data publicly available, then I'm sure there's still going to be a lot of politics and a lot of wrangling about, well, what counts as the kind of data that I'm willing to have, as representing me and my work. And then there will be demands from the people who want to use that to make it more understandable, or to make it, for the public to make it more accessible to pressure groups and so on, who may want to use certain kinds of evidence to arrive at certain kinds of conclusions. So I do think there will be a lot to be unpacked around what it means to have data, because sure as hell people are going to disagree about how they want to have that stored and available.
Could I just...
Yes, Graeme.
You put your finger on a really, really crucial point for us, is what do we mean by openness, even? And that's the principle that the report is trying to advocate, but it's not an unqualified good, and that's certainly something that's come through from our discussions so far. But then what does that mean in detail? The devil's obviously in the detail. But my sense of what's evolving for us is that by openness we don't mean free of all controls, but what we mean is free of unjustified restrictions. And the presumption should be that there should be sharing unless there's good reasons not to share. For example, because it has implications for individual private interests, or because there might be longer-term consequences if those couldn't be identified, etc. So I think there is a more nuanced definition emerging from our work, but you're absolutely right, it's crucial, it's central.
Next question is here, and then in the middle, and then further down in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name's Andy Sterling from Sussex University. I wanted to go back to this issue of whether we're discussing, and the work that's been described is discussing openness as a servant or as a master of science. There's a grey area between, but to illustrate that, much of the really interesting discussion here has been on making data sets available to enable people to assist in various ways in viewing what science is doing and possibly also adding to it. But there's also, Geoffrey Boulton also mentioned very interestingly, the possibility that data about how money is being spent, which is actually surprisingly difficult to get one's head around, is also might be made available more clearly so that people can see where the priorities are. So that's what I mean by the servant and the master of science. And I wonder if there's a lesson that might be learned from the way the public engagement debates played out over the last 15 years, whereby there are two agendas mixed in ways that are quite complicated. One is to engage people so they understand better and are more trusting and, to be frank, compliant with science and its aspirations, and on the other hand, to exercise more control over the directions in which science goes. And that's a strange dance that goes on, but there's a sense in which the two are in tension. So I raise this question because I'm wondering, Steve Yearley especially mentioned that it might be Volume 2, Volume 3 to go on to look at how might more ambitious forms of access be given to data and to engage in debate about which direction science goes in. But if the understanding has already been reinforced that the best way the best way science can be open to the public is through the public engaging as citizen scientists and simply helping science to serve science better, there may be hidden tensions. So I'm wondering, I'd be very interested in the panel's view on that, and whether there are things that can be done now, right at the outset, in establishing what open science means, to include both, and be very clear that some are more easy to achieve than others, but in the long run, there's a logic between the two.
Yeah, do you want to say?
I mean, I think it's it's naive to suppose, as I think has been applied, that citizen scientists, and in a sense it's an inappropriate term because it could sound rather condescending. It's not intended to be, but it's just the absence of anything else. That somehow they are sort of slavishly pursue the priorities set by professional salaried scientists. My limited experience of the phenomenon is that's far from the truth. And indeed, they begin to ask questions which very often their professional colleagues have not really considered. I mean, I go back to work that was done, you probably know, by Brian Wynne about the impact of the Chernobyl disaster on the farms and grasslands of West Cumbria, where scientists went out and said to the farmers, well, this will be okay, it'll all wash away, and so on. And the farmers were much less than persuaded. And indeed, some of the perceptions that the farmers had at the time have proven to be much more reliable than those of the presumptions of the scientist. And it seems to me that's the sort of thing we should be looking at. It's all about, it's about communication. Communication is a two-way street. It's about you and I, or any two of us, or any number of us, communicating to each other, and not simply sitting there and listening passively. I mean, it seems to me that science will be much the poorer, or human understanding will be much the poorer, if simply a small subset of professionals dictates the argument. And that's exactly what we need to get away from.
Yes.
I think for me, it's partly about communicating the uncertainty of science too. There's an assumption that the evidence will give you the right answer, and it doesn't happen as easily as that. And just talking about Chernobyl, I had a whole body scan while I was in Dounreay, and I have a little Chernobyl peak, because I happened to be in the island of Arran that weekend, so I've got it, and I've been there. So I don't believe these scientists at all. So I think it's partly about uncertainty, and I speak particularly from a clinical perspective. I would like people out there, like me, a citizen who's going to have something done to them, what the evidence is like and how strong that evidence is. And I have a particular condition at the moment, not me personally, but an individual, who doesn't know what is best for them. And every doctor we ask gives us a different view. How do I assess that evidence? I assess it because there is uncertainty. And somehow we need to get over that as part of the public discussion, that there are things that might change, and we may even need more evidence.
Did you? Yeah.
No, I obviously Andy and I come at these issues from a very similar background, so I feel that I shouldn't really be addressing this one, but I just want to say two very quick things. I mean, so it's very interesting that you come back to us with Brian's radioactive sheep as an example, and I think it is a very good example. But in a sense, the slide that you showed about this could then do with maybe having a radioactive sheep to make the point. I mean, obviously they don't look very different, but they, maybe they smile a little less.
Glare in the dark.
But I mean, in order to express the idea that this isn't only about citizen scientists who want to further the mainstream agenda, but ones who may, in some sense, want to be critical. And if one doesn't want to do radioactive sheep, I mean, I think that there is a lot of cases where, in the health area, and in some cases, particularly in the health genetics area, where patients or people who are the relatives of patients form organizations that want to change medical research policy. And in some sense, I think, that they occupy a very interesting middle ground, because often they're, in a sense, arguing with the medical profession about its priorities, but there may be particular medical scientists who agree with them about the importance of studying this or that phenomenon. So I think that would be quite an interesting kind of middle case for that point.
Yeah, I'll just try and carry on, because we'll try and fit in three more questions. One just here, just beside you. The mic's just beside you.
There it is. Burkhard Schäfer from University of Edinburgh. Geoffrey, in the step model of the scientific research, I think it was step number 3, where you come to the publication stage. And one thing I think that was not directly on the slide was a sort of science internal quality assurance mechanism, and in particular, obviously, the peer review that we use for publication and also adjudication of research proposals. Now, that is obviously one important part of quality assurance, of communicating science, but also the one that seemed by its very nature to be the least amenable to open science as an ideal, because we think we profit a lot from the fact that it is behind closed doors and people can speak freely and without fear of repercussions. But we obviously also know that, firstly, it's to breaking point simply from an administrative perspective. The public trust in it has been reduced as a result of various either real scandals or failings or alleged failings because it was behind closed doors. And I was just wondering how far the open science agenda should also address the issue of that aspect of quality control, which for all sorts of reasons seem to be in desperate need of reform. Stephen mentioned different methods of using online publication. The Public Library of Science Online, for instance, already uses the ability to comment directly on an article in a sort of real-time way, extending the peer review process far beyond the crucial moment behind these closed doors. So I was just wondering if that aspect too needs to be brought under the umbrella of open science as an agenda.
Yeah, Geoffrey.
One of the things I hope we're being very careful about is not to predict the way in which individuals and society will utilize in pretty creative and probably unpredictable ways these new tools that are available. And so one of the things I hope we don't do is say, well, we think you should use them this way or that way or some other way. I mean, at the moment there are debates about peer review, which, I mean, I think there are sort of probably three polar positions. One of them is that it's a wonderful process. It's a quality control mechanism. It weeds out the erroneous, the repetitive, the unreadable, and so on, which may be true. Then the middle point is that actually it's a very human activity. It involves malice, envy, competitiveness. And actually, if you talk to a journal editor, they will say, well, actually, that's the right one. But actually, there's a third one, of course, and that is reflected by what I describe as the internet riot in relation to science. If you just put it out, and if it's an important and interesting area, then the probability is that it will be more rigorously reviewed than the most assiduous peer reviewer. The problem is, of course, what about all the science that nobody cares about? Going back to the point back here, you know, an awful lot of this. I mean, the typical citation rate, I don't know what it is now, but the average scientific article was 1.5 people would refer to it, which at that time, and it's probably still true, means an awful lot of science, frankly, isn't worth being published or being done. If you then say that to a politician, they'll say, well, tell us which part, and the answer is we can't, I'm afraid. You only know after the event. So I think it's, I think coming back to your point, I think these are things which in a sense we have to wait, we have to, what we don't want to do is to block off the opportunity for a social activity which can be highly creative. We want to stimulate that, really. And it's entirely possible, I think. I mean, I'm not necessarily an advocate, but it's entirely possible within the decade peer review in the way we know it will have gone.
There's a question just here.
Brown, University of Edinburgh. Two of the agents of change that you had on your slide, Geoffrey, were the funders and the learned societies. And I'd just like to explore that with a question, basically. The Wellcome Trust was very clear that the data from the Human Genome Project went out immediately as raw data, but they still require grant holders to protect their intellectual property and then hand that over to the Trust. The Research Council, at least BBSRC, reckoned that its costs would increase by 1/3 if it were to do proper open source data on the research it funded, or another way, the amount of science it funded would reduce by 1/4. So there's a problem there, I think. And the learned societies, although the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Edinburgh are funded in a certain way, many of the learned societies are dependent on their journal income to exist and support the students. So how do we manage those two groupings as agents of change?
Well, I think the first one, in terms of the cost of doing these things, we had a discussion in the debate that Steve referred to earlier today about this. And one of the points made that, I mean, of course, these processes will be costly. And the question is, how comprehensive do you want to make them? If you made everything subject to this sort of process, then the cost would be very large. Do we know what it is? No, we don't. What sort of order of magnitude might it be? Well, I'd say on order 10%, plus or minus, I don't know, 10, maybe 20, maybe 20%. And one of the comments that was made, that will mean less research is funded. And my answer would be not necessarily, well, maybe less research, but actually maybe we get more science from it. And that ought to be the key issue. It might mean that the social structure of science would shift and change, but I think there is evidence which is not absolutely overwhelming, but some evidence that suggests that openness of this sort in the science process sensu stricto actually generates a faster, better outcome in the medium term. I mean, I think the point you made earlier about what about all the stuff that no one's ever going to want to look at, and finding a way of is there a way of establishing beforehand what it is no one's ever going to look at is the difficulty, I think. In relation to learned societies and their journals, it's just one of those things, you know, we have to come to terms with these changes. I mean, I think early on, I think Ken, you mentioned the issue of, you know, not only is the internet a marvellous means whereby information, knowledge, understanding can be transmitted, but actually misinformation and ignorance can be transmitted as well. And it's, you know, it's the old Pandora's box story. You make an existential decision whether or not to open it, because once you've opened it, closing it is rather difficult. Can we put a barrier against misuse on the internet? My answer would be, well, not 100% a barrier, but we ought to think of means whereby there are processes in the electronic world which, I mean, you know, one of the things our fellow citizens, I think, want from science, and areas which are of real concern to them, is when there are conflicts, and there have been a number of obvious conflicts in recent years, it's not so much that they want to know, well, who's right. Of course they want to know that, but I think most of them are sensible enough to know that's a very difficult thing to do. They want to know what are the processes which might ultimately determine where error lies. So I think there are a whole series of issues that are bundled up there that we have to, you know, which are thorny ones.
One of the questions that falls from that is there a way in which the citizen scientist or the citizen can actually shift the funding agenda? And I think it's possible. I've recently given up the chairmanship of the National Cancer Research Institute. It has no money. To get on the board, you've got to put at least £1 million on the table. All the research councils, health departments, etc., got some scientists, and we've got some patients. And they quite clearly dictate some of the priorities that the money has to go into. We're not spending enough on prevention, put some money in. Who's going to do it? Department of Health, Cancer Research UK. So you can, if you have an intelligent population, and that's not meant to be a pejorative term, but a population that understands the issue, who are not scientists at all, can actually shift the agenda. And that's quite good, I think.
Graeme, you want to say something?
Guys raised an issue actually that's not come up so far, but I think it's really fundamentally important, and that's the question of the possible privacy implications for individuals. So another policy that the Wellcome Trust and the National Institutes of Health instituted was the in and around genome-wide association studies, and they expected those to be put up on the internet, and then it was shown that it was technically possible to identify individuals by putting other pieces of information, and then they pulled the site and they pulled the policy because of concerns about privacy. Now, that raises an awful lot of questions about, well, what are public's expectations of privacy in the context of a culture that does promote more openness and there are arguably more sharing of data, and what are we willing to tolerate, and what do policies need to look like in order to respond to those expectations? Because the one thing that's absolutely clear is there's no such thing as zero risk when it comes to our privacy. But that reaction from those funders was very sudden and pretty extreme. But whether that was the right reaction is, I think, is a question that needs to be explored.
Okay, one more question in the middle, and then I think we'll finish with the lady in the green.
Thank you, Cameron Rose. I'm an elected councillor and one of those struggling politicians struggling to know which bits of science to respond to and which bits not to. Professor Boulton, you had, can I just say thank you to the RSE and to all those who've spoken for a fascinating evening. Professor Boulton, amongst the many fascinating phrases and things which you have said, I think I noted down you saying this: the structures of which many of us are a part have some pretty fierce ways of dealing with those benighted souls who disagree. That strikes me as something which a number of people who are at the cutting edge of the new media would consider they have been treated in recent times. Do you personally have any regrets about your participation in and conduct of the Russell inquiry into ClimateGate?
Well, the simple answer that is no.
Yes, I think that is a one-word answer. Yes, okay. Yes, go ahead with your question.
I'd like to ask the panel about two things we don't seem to have addressed all evening, and that's two things that stand between public understanding of science. One of them is the fact that science is increasingly threatened as part of the national curriculum. It seems to be dropping off the agenda at many schools, and indeed some universities have stopped teaching it altogether. So that's one thing. How do we prepare the public to understand science? And the second thing, which is equally important, is, and there won't be any scientist in the room who hasn't had their carefully constructed remarks to the press mangled beyond recognition. How do we get past the barrier of the press, which stands between scientists trying to communicate and the public who want to understand it?
Thank you. There are two quite distinct questions there. Yes?
Science education is critical. If we lose that, then we're missing things. Those of you who know the top ends of the civil service, generally with an arts background rather than a science background, realise how quick they are at picking things up, and they're actually pretty good at it. But we need much more than that. And I think at this time in our nation's history, not to have a strong science education base is I think, a great pity.
Yeah, education one.
Well, no, my daughter's too young to be in school, so I haven't. I'm not really into the education thing. But I want to say something about this. Then I come back to the education thing. I mean, it was very interesting that the example that Geoffrey gave was about the Cumbrian sheep farmers. And so our experience is that although there is a kind of a generalised concern about the public not understanding science, in case after case where science impinges on people's lives, it becomes apparent that people can kind of get up to speed on the things they need relatively quickly. So, so I don't want to say this as a sociologist, but even Geoffrey has said, that the people from the National Radiological Protection Board didn't know as much about the circulation of cesium in the environment as the farmers and the sheep managed to do. So, I mean, I always feel there's a danger that, I think your point is entirely justified, but I think there's a danger in overdoing the point, in that my experience is that when it comes to controversies about health issues or environmental issues or, I don't know, IT and computing issues, the public, whether they have a good scientific education or not, is actually much smarter than you might on the face of it expect them to be about these things. And of course, only recently there's been this news about the upsurge again in people taking physics and so on in school because, suddenly some of these things have become sexy and exciting again, So the Infinite Monkey Cage or whatever it's called on Radio 4 and so on, where it mixes, sort of science and stand-up and so on. It's kind of, it's not nerdy any longer, it's kind of cool. So, I mean, I'm not so worried about that. And I mean, so maybe the thing to have, this kind of bright club, which is this idea about, scientists doing stand-up, is maybe the way to go rather than curriculum reform.
Yes, Jeff.
Can I just chip in? I've got a particular bee in my bonnet, which is that I think the science education to give our kids may be appropriate grounding for those who go on to become scientists. Although how influential it is, I'm not sure. But I'm pretty persuaded that it doesn't give an appropriate education for those who merely go on to become citizens, if you like. And my argument would be something like this. The science we teach children at school is for men, except in some exceptional curricula, it is science that we indeed know very well. It's about the acceleration due to gravity and the like, where the errors in our measurement and our theories are very, very small indeed. But actually, most of the science that is of concern in the public domain is right at the edge of our understanding, and the uncertainties are very large. And there's the presumption, which is certainly there amongst at least some politicians and some in quite influential positions, and many members of the public before they get engaged with science, if they're concerned to do so, have this view that science is about certainty. Now, the only people I know of who believe in certainty are the politicians, and for them the future is certain. The past may be changing, but the future's certain. I mean, there's this story, I forget who it was, a US president, it was either Roosevelt or Harry S. Truman, who said to have had this comment on his desk that what he wanted was a one-armed scientist, someone who wouldn't say on the one hand this and on the other hand that. And actually that's the problem. Most of us who are doing active science actually know that what we are is trying to find some rocks of solid information in an otherwise uncertain world. And yet the popular perception too frequently, not as much, possibly I'm overdoing it slightly, but too frequently is about the certainty of science. And that certainly is far from the truth in most of the areas with which we're concerned.
Just to finish, could I just ask you to comment as well on this idea that perhaps the media don't understand science well enough and the mangling of scientific...
Well, I don't think we do too badly from the media. We all recognise the pressures the poor dears are under. We all of us read... I won't say the Scotsman, nor even the Herald, but there's some newspapers we read with a very large pinch of salt. I think, frankly, the amount of science, very good science, we get on television now is extraordinary. I mean, it's increased enormously in recent years, and I think I think too many of we scientists whinge about the media. It's there, it's a reality. We know what the motivations for much of the media are. We just get on with it and engage with it in sensible fashions. I don't think we gain very much by preaching to our our colleagues in the press and telling them how they should do their job. They'll take it very ill, I'm afraid.
Okay.
No, it's just 2 points. The first one relates to the kind of science. I agree entirely with Geoffrey that the kind of science that's taught may not be the right science for the kind of science that's taught may not be the right science at all. It's about the uncertainty part. And secondly, the media component. I've had my fair share of the occasional appearance in the media. But one of the things to do is to be straightforward and actually have prepared something beforehand. Most journalists just want a bit of paper to go away and write it. And if you give them the wrong thing, they'll write it differently. So you've got to be highly prepared for it and be prepared for them to say things that you didn't say at all. It's the story of my life, in fact.
Okay, well, could I just thank you all very much for what has been, I think, a very interesting evening. Thank you very much for your participation. But I would ask you also to thank the panel members who I think have been exceptionally good tonight.